in 1968 under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. When he left office, he remained silent about the war for nearly 30 years. Now his thoughts and second thoughts about Vietnam and his role in it are revealed in a much talked about book, In Retrospect. Secretary of Defense under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, Robert S. McNamara, is our guest tonight. Coming up on Straightforward. In his book, In Retrospect, Robert McNamara wrote a line which may well be quoted for a long time. This is a book I planned never to write. In it, he breaks the silence about the American tragedy dubbed McNamara's War. It's about mistakes made, reasons why. Former Secretary of State Robert S. McNamara. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, sir. I'm delighted to be here.
Tell me about that line. You never intended to write this book.
I never intended to write it because I thought there were several reasons, but one of them was I didn't think I was wise enough.
Really?
I don't mean...
I mean, you were wise enough to be Secretary of State. Why not wise enough to write a book about it?
For one reason, as I look back on it, and this is not universally accepted today, I believe it was a tragedy.
The war.
The war. And I believe that there should be lessons learned from that. And we should examine how this tragedy came about. We should draw lessons from that. I wasn't sure that as a participant in it, I was wise enough to draw those lessons. And it wasn't, to tell you the truth, until about 3 or 4 years ago that I reached that point. If I may take just 1 second.
Sure.
In the preface, I quote some lines from T.S. Eliot. My wife brought these to my attention 35, 40 years ago. And T.S. Eliot wrote in the Fourth Quartet, "We shall not cease from exploring, and at the end of our exploration, we will return to where we started and know the place for the first time." In a sense, I hadn't gone down that road far enough, and I couldn't look back with enough wisdom to warrant writing the book. That was one reason. The second reason was I kept no diary. I took no papers, with the exception of a small 3-ring binder, and I wasn't capable of doing the research. And suddenly, 2 events occurred. One, I don't want to say I had a flash of wisdom, but about 2.5 or 3 years ago, I sat in my office one day and I wrote out in hand. I don't use a computer. I wrote out in hand what I thought the lessons were. I suddenly believed I could see clearly that. And at that, roughly that same moment of time, a young historian who's an assistant professor of history at the Naval Academy asked if he could help me write this story. And he did the research, and that's what I needed.
Biggest
those 2
lesson
things
learned.
came together.
Biggest lesson learned from Vietnam.
Well, there isn't a single lesson, excepting only that I think we made a mistake and we should learn from our mistakes. That's, in a sense, the biggest lesson. But people say, well, what was the biggest error, or what's the biggest lesson? There isn't one lesson. In the last chapter, I list 11 lessons. Those are the lessons that I wrote down 2.5 to 3 years ago.
Let me ask you about
when we're on time, I hope we can talk about.
Okay, I want to get to those.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back around to those. But let me set up for people a framework.
Sure.
My understanding of it is Eisenhower, before he left office in 1960, basically said, "Don't get in a land war in Asia."
He said, if I may correct you, in 1954, Eisenhower said, "The dominoes will fall if we lose Vietnam," meaning that the
other countries will start
Malaysia, Indonesia, Cambodia, Laos.
That set up the domino
Thailand,
theory of Southeast Asia.
That's right.
But didn't he advise against a land war in Asia?
Well, it wasn't so much he advised against it, and he didn't get involved in it. And I think he was very wise not to.
He put advisors into Vietnam, but no combat troops.
Right. But what I outline in the book is a meeting with President Eisenhower and President Kennedy, the last full day Eisenhower was in office, January 19, 1961, at which time, according to the notes taken by Clark Clifford, my notes, by the way, differ a little from Clark's, Eisenhower said, in effect, if we have to go in unilaterally, militarily, to save Laos and Vietnam, we should do so. I have a different version of that, which is quoted in the book. Kennedy asked me to write notes. The 2 notes disagree. 3 weeks before January 19th.
What do your notes say?
Well, my notes say that when President Kennedy put the direct question to President Eisenhower, should we go in unilaterally, militarily, if necessary, they were talking about Laos, to save Laos, President Eisenhower didn't answer directly. And And I concluded that he wasn't prepared to say exactly then what he would do. However, we've since learned that
That version makes more sense even politically. A Republican president doesn't want to say to a Democrat that can be quoted the next day.
You're absolutely right on that. But what we've learned subsequently is that 3 weeks before, Eisenhower told his cabinet that he believed, if necessary, the U.S. should go in unilaterally. Now, please let me just add one thing. I don't want to say what Eisenhower would have done. Whatever the hell we did, you can't blame on him. It's us.
Okay. Now, Jack Kennedy put 26,000 troops in, essentially.
No, 16,000 advisors.
Combatant advisors, though.
Well, they
guys
were,
who could fire.
Well, yes, but they were advisors. They weren't supposed to fire. And I want to differentiate between what he did and not what Johnson did, what we all did subsequently. You can't blame it on Kennedy. It was started then, that's for sure.
You put 16,000 guys in a combat zone, you're going to have a problem.
You're damn right.
No.
And you got to think about what's going to follow.
No.
You're right.
Now, Jack Kennedy also gave the most militaristic speech of the 20th century. We will go anywhere.
The inauguration.
The inauguration speech was the most militaristic speech. He founded the Green Berets, a killer force. Right. He seemed enamored of war because he was of the World War II generation.
No. I want to come back to this, the World War II generation, but he was not enamored of war. In this book, I say what I believe Kennedy would have done had he lived. Now, first let me say...
You believe he would have pulled out of it?
I believe he would have pulled out. But I want to make very clear, I say that not as a comment on Kennedy. I say it as a comment on us.
Right.
We who had worked with Kennedy, Dean Rusk, myself, others, I say now I think he would have pulled out. We didn't pull out. Why didn't we?
Was there a conversation with Mike Mansfield in which Mike Mansfield, Senator Mike Mansfield, advised Kennedy to get out, and Kennedy said, we can't get out before the next election?
No, absolutely not.
That never took place?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
But what I say in here, and it's a very important point, and let me digress a moment to say, I didn't know that President Kennedy had tapes of meetings. We know about Nixon's tapes.
Right.
But Kennedy, unbeknownst to us, made tapes of some, not many, but some meetings. There's a very critical meeting, October 2nd, 1963, a few weeks before he died, at which time I had recommended, and it was decided, very controversial at the time, number one, we, the government, would plan to withdraw the 16,000 advisors by the end of 1965. Number two, as the first step, we'd withdraw 1,000 within 90 days by the end of 63. Number three, to set that in concrete, we would announce it that day. And this was very controversial. I wanted to be sure my memory and the records were correct. I learned there was a tape of that meeting in the library. I got permission of the family to go up there and listen to it, and I did. And that is what he did. That was his, in a sense, last official act. He died 5-6 weeks after.
You spent a lot of time with President Kennedy, and you've read all the material about him since his presidency.
Much of it.
Is there any insight into him as a person working in the Oval Office that you could give us that you have not read about in other accounts?
Yes. At least there's I think this is an important point. You mentioned his inaugural address, and those words commit, in a sense, commit the U.S. to save the world. That was about what it meant. But I believe, and I'm going to give evidence of this in a moment, that one of his primary objectives was to prevent this nation from becoming involved in war. And as evidence of that, let me tell you that he asked us to read Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, which was the story of World War I, very early on, I don't know, in January or February after it was inaugurated. And in that, Barbara Tuchman, in a sense, says, the German Chancellor, well, the World War started, said, we bungled into war, and that cost the lives of millions of people. And Kennedy said to us, we are not going to bungle into war. That's the first point.
He said that while you were bungling into war?
No. This was before we ever got it.
Before you did.
But we damn near bungled in 90 days later when the Cuba Bay of Pigs came up.
Right.
And that was an absolute debacle. And it's true that the previous administration, Eisenhower administration, had trained those people, but by God, it was our decision.
Why did you guys, after the troops were on their way, pull back from the Bay of Pigs?
That's just what I'm going to tell you. That's exactly the point. The military, it was a CIA operation, but both the chiefs and the CIA, after the initial invasion, in effect, failed, asked that we introduce U.S. air power to save it. And Kennedy said, no way. I told you ahead of time we were not going to do it. We're not going to do it. I'm not going to get involved in a war
But did
there.
he really think hitting a beach with 1,500 guys could take over a country?
They thought so. The Republicans who had trained them thought so. And let me stop.
So there was no backup. There was no backup plan.
Let me stop you a second here.
Yeah.
This is a very important point. This was a CIA operation directed by CIA and
Approved by Jack Kennedy.
look, no question.
I mean,
about it.
Eisenhower planned it. Kennedy took it
Look,
over.
and Kennedy.
We got to go to a break, Mr. Secretary.
We've got to come back a second.
We're going to come back to this
Okay.
point. Okay. Very exciting, very interesting piece of history, living history. Secretary Robert McNamara, stay with us.
Support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Interesting rhetoric. Great moment in a speech. Is it the right mission for the United States to provide liberty around the world?
Today, no. At that time, please give me a
No,
time
go.
to
Go
really
ahead.
say. At that time, I thought so. Our people thought
You
so.
were 44 years old.
I was 44. And the particular point I want to make, he and Dean Rusk and I, and people interviewing me, I always ask them, how old are they? And they say, well, I'm 40 or 45. I say, you don't understand. We were wrong in Vietnam. Don't misunderstand me. But think of where we came from. That president and Dean Rusk and I, in a sense, a lesser role, we fought for 3, 4, 5 years in World War II. And Churchill said, we, the West, failed. We would have saved the lives of millions of our soldiers in World War II had we responded to Hitler when he began that aggression. Instead, we waited, and it cost millions to do that. And in a sense, Kennedy was saying,
We got to get in sooner to stop it
that's
earlier.
right. And today, it was saying, in effect, in that inaugural address, we face a Soviet threat. Now, why did he say it? Because after we won World War II, the Soviets took Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia. In our period, a few months after that, and that was January '61. In August of '61, the Soviets tried to take West Berlin, and I called the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Norstead, over to my office in the Pentagon. I said, Larry, look, they did A, we did B, they did C, we did D, they did E, we did F. How's it going to evolve from here? He said, well, they'll do G, we'll do H, they'll do J, they'll do I, they'll do K. I said, what do we do then? Well, he said, it's going to be tough. We'll have to use nuclear weapons. Now, that was in August '61. A year later, in October of '62, Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba, and to this day, our people don't know how close we came to nuclear war. Only in the last 2 years have we understood it. In June, just one further word. In June of '67, the Egyptians were determined to eliminate Israel from the face of the earth, and they were planning an attack. The Israelis learned of it. They preempted. They knocked the hell out of the Egyptians and the Jordanians. And at that moment, the Soviets, believing the Israelis would go after the Syrians, they used the hotline for the first time ever. They sent a message from Kosygin to Johnson saying, if you want war, you'll get it. Now, all I'm trying to create is the atmosphere we lived in. We totally misjudged, I think, the Soviet-Chinese threat in Vietnam, but we had reason to. This was our experience.
A young flyer on a Navy carrier, the Ticonderoga, named Doug Webster, little known story, died because the plane fell off the deck of the carrier. Are you familiar with that story?
I don't believe so.
The suspicion is that later a nuclear weapon was found at the bottom of the Pacific. That our flyers were in fact testing whether nuclear weapons could be used in Vietnam at the time, and young Webster was asked to fly that plane. The bomb was probably not fitted for the plane. It was somewhat of a cover-up over his death. It's never been revealed. But they found a nuclear weapon at the bottom. The Japanese found a nuclear weapon sort of radiating at the bottom of the Pacific in the trench where this plane went over.
Let me say, I'm not familiar with the story. However, now that you raise it, let me make an important point about this book. At no time during the 7 years I was associated with Vietnam did we really consider using nuclear weapons. However, as I mentioned in the book, the chiefs on 2 or 3 occasions were candid enough to say to the president, we recommend you do ABC. If you do it, you should recognize you may come into conflict with China and the Soviet Union, and if we do, we'll have to consider using nuclear weapons. Now, that is a very dangerous situation.
Do you
And the
believe
book-
we do?
the book-
Didn't we test whether or not we could deliver
no,
nuclear weapons?
We didn't have to test it. Hell, we knew how to deliver nuclear weapons. There was no question about that. I can't believe the story. I don't mean to say it.
No, I'm just curious
but
about it because.
But I guarantee you, we didn't need to
How
test
did that
it.
nuclear weapon get to the bottom of the Pacific?
The answer is I can't tell. We I won't say we lost. We had a similar problem, as I remember, in Spanish or Portuguese waters. But we didn't need to test whether we could.
Well, the question was
load or
whether we
deliver
were
a bomb.
testing delivering
No.
planes off nuclear weapons off carriers.
Well, I don't have any question at some point we may have tested, but we didn't have to do it in relation to Vietnam. We knew how to do it before then, and we had other ways of practicing, and never did we reach the point where we had to do it. But in the book, there's an appendix, and if your readers buy it, I hope to God they'll read the appendix, because the nuclear risk is still great. We need to think about it, and I relate the Cuban situation. I want to go back just 1 second,
Yeah,
if
go
I
ahead.
may, to Kennedy, because as to the Bay of Pigs, and you were saying, why didn't he
Why didn't he support? Why didn't he
That's
go
right.
over there?
And what I wanted to say was, because he was determined to keep this nation out of war if he possibly could without endangering our security. There was no need to engage in war in Cuba to protect our security then. He did the same thing a year later in connection with the Cuban Missile Crisis. On Saturday, the 27th of October, 1962, the day before Sunday when Khrushchev announced he was going to withdraw, we spent most of the day arguing about whether, in his words, we'd go to war over a bunch of goddamn junk, Jupiter missiles in Turkey. And he was determined not to do it.
What was the deal he cut with Khrushchev to back off?
Well,
To pull our missiles at a later date out of Turkey?
no, this is a fine point, but he told Khrushchev it was junk, and it was, and he told him that in effect he thought he'd instructed the State Department to get him out of there 6 months earlier, and he told Khrushchev, I'm going to take him out regardless of what you do. If you ever say it's a deal, they'll go back in.
Good. I got to take a break. We got to go to a break here. We're with Mr. Secretary. I apologize for interrupting. We got to take a commercial break. We'll be right back.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
We're going to come back to the CIA. Where were you when that took place, and what effect did it have on you?
I was skiing
You were.
in Aspen, Colorado. I left the Pentagon February 29, 1968. I think that was during the month of March. I spent the month of March skiing in Aspen, Colorado.
Nobody ever knows whether you quit or got fired. as
That's a
secretary.
wonderful question. Kay Graham gave a book party for me 2 nights ago, the former publisher of the Washington Post. And I said, Kay's been an old friend for
Right.
35 years. I said, she and I are in violent disagreement on
Really?
one part of this book, one part of the book. And it relates to exactly what you said. I write in the book that to this day, now this sounds insane, but to this day, I don't know whether I quit or was fired. And Kay said, that's absurd. Everybody knows you were fired. And I don't think I was fired. But I'll say this. If
Did you come back and your office was cleaned out or anything?
No, it's a long story, and it's related here.
yeah.
You don't have
We
time.
won't get into it here,
But let me just say that the problem was that on the 1st of November of 1967, I gave a memorandum to the president, which I know upset him greatly. And
What did the memorandum say?
the memorandum said,
In essence,
it said, Mr. President, we cannot win militarily. We must move to political negotiations to try to negotiate a disengagement militarily that will result in perhaps communist association in government of South Vietnam, but will not permit South Vietnam to be used as a stepping stone by the Soviet Union and China to take over all
At
of Asia.
what point in
And-
time in the 60s did you know we couldn't win Vietnam?
Well, I won't say. I believe we couldn't win militarily, and I want to differentiate winning militarily from losing Vietnam to the communists. I believe that in December '65, there's a passage in
But
the
you
book.
did not go to the president and say, Mr. President, we can't win.
Oh yes, it's
You
in
did.
the book.
You
Oh,
went in
absolutely.
the day you decided. Because a lot of people blame you for just being a loyal soldier and saying,
look, I deserve We all deserve blame. We were responsible. Nobody can shift the blame.
I mean, weren't there days you wanted to get out of the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, we have blown it. We are killing guys. This is stupid. We can't win this thing. We got to get out.
You're about 90% right.
Really?
Except on the point we got to get out. We got to get out, but we've got to get out in a way that
Doesn't collapse the country and hand it over to the country.
That's the point. That is the point. And that's what we were trying to do. And ultimately,
Was Nixon's policy of Vietnamization a good policy then?
the Vietnamization was absolutely correct.
Did
don't
Nixon prosecute it well?
I don't want to.
You don't want to comment
No,
on that?
I left the Pentagon February 29, 68. I don't want to talk about
Second guess who
That
they
is
did
right.
after that.
Henry Kissinger's an old friend of mine. I'm not going to comment on Nixon and Kissinger. But I do want to go back just 1 second to this point that we feared, and with some considerable cause, the risk to this country and the West of communist takeover of Asia. Dean Rusk wrote a memo, and it's quoted in here, which, to tell you the truth, I didn't see. I suspect it's the only paper he gave to the president in my 7 years of any importance that he didn't show to me. He wrote it, and he said, Mr. President, if we lose Vietnam, we run the risk, and these are the exact words in the memo, we run the risk of a catastrophic war, World War III. Now, that's what we feared. I think we were wrong, but that's what we were trying to do, protect the West, protect the country.
Most people see this book as a mea culpa on your part. What exactly are you guilty of in your own mind?
Misjudgment. And that's what's reflected here. And what I'm trying to say is, please, Mr. America, look back, reflect, try to learn from our mistakes, and don't repeat them.
Are there any parallels today where we could walk in?
Yes.
Show me what we're about to do.
You got.
I understand, but the viewers, we got to explain to them where these parallels and dangers.
Let me just give you a couple.
Oklahoma City. What should we do about these terrorists?
We never finished on CIA.
Okay.
I hope
we're
get
coming back to CIA.
Okay, but just on Oklahoma City, I think we should be spending, I'll call it billions, on penetrating the terrorist organizations across the world.
Should we use the CIA internally all over the country?
I want to say the combination of CIA and FBI, I think, should be used to penetrate terrorist organizations across the world. Look at Japan. It was driven off the front pages this morning, but they had another gas attack in Tokyo yesterday after having that one a few weeks ago. Now, I don't know what caused it. I'm not arguing that I know the cause. All I'm arguing is that our society, our civilization in the Western world is very vulnerable to terrorists.
Well, there are certain Democrats in Congress who are currently trying to dismantle the CIA.
Well, I'm not sure that's correct. I'm a Democrat.
Well, Mr. Torricelli seems to want to dismantle
I am a Democrat. But let me say this. I have tremendous respect and regard for the CIA. And let me just take a second on this. You mentioned earlier the Bay of Pigs. It was a total debacle. It wasn't solely Kennedy's fault, because he asked his advisors, and with one exception, every single one said, go ahead. And after it was over...
Who was the exception?
The exception was not a member of the administration. The only person in the room that was not a member of the administration was Bill Fulbright, and he recommended against it. Every other person in the room, about 19, military and civilian advisors recommended he went in.
Keep talking about the CIA. I got 30 seconds to a break. We'll come back and pick it up after that. Go ahead.
Well,
CIA.
On the CIA, the debacle in the Bay of Pigs, in my opinion, was a function not of incompetence in the CIA, but of maladministration, poor organization. They had lumped together in one organization responsibility for evaluating what would happen if an operation were carried out, which is the CIA's function, to evaluate in advance what will happen.
But not to run operations.
But not to run it. And they put the responsibility for running it with the same people that were evaluating. And they made a terrible mistake. They said, you said, put 1,500 people down there. What the hell could 1,500 people do? The CIA said...
I mean, that seems like common sense to me.
The CIA said the people of Cuba will feel liberated. They'll rise up and welcome the 1,500.
Anybody ever asked you to go anywhere with 1,500 people, I'd say no. You get a lot more than that at a high school football game.
You're
you can't
absolutely
do it.
right. But I want to have one more word after
we're going to
come back.
We're going to come back right after this with Robert McNamara. Stay with us. get to this combat footage in a second, but go ahead and finish on Dick
Well,
Helms.
I
and
just
CIA.
wanted to say on the CIA and its role that, as I suggested, they should never combine operational responsibility and intelligence collection and evaluation. Dick Helms, who was director of CIA for many of the years of my 7, perhaps 5, was in the room in my presence many times, National Security Council meetings with President Johnson, and President Johnson would say, Dick, now you tell us about this. What should we do in this at a certain? And Dick said, and this is tough to say to Mr. President, I can't answer. I should never participate in a policy decision. That's for you and your advice. I'm the person that can
I'm the
give you
intelligence gatherer.
I'm A, the intelligence gatherer, and B, I'll evaluate. You ask me what the likelihood is that Khrushchev will start a war if we put the quarantine in, as we did, and I'll give you my evaluation of it. You ask me whether we're accomplishing in North Vietnam with our bombing what the chiefs and McNamara hope to accomplish, I'll give you that. But if you ask me, should we expand our bombing in Vietnam? No, I won't answer that. That's pretty damn tough.
That is tough.
And Dick Helms, in my presence, told the president several times that. And the point I want to make is, at various times since then, we have compromised the integrity of the director of CIA by forcing him in, or permitting him in some cases, at his desire, to participate in policy. We should never permit that.
Well, I have a feeling President Clinton's about to make that same mistake, but we'll see. History will tell that too. Let me go back to you personally. You've been carrying a heavy burden for 30 years then, because you know that you participated in the death of thousands of Americans.
That's correct.
What impact has that had on you personally? You're approaching, what, 80?
I'll be 80 in about a year. That's correct. Well, as I suggest, when I quoted those lines from T.S. Eliot, I think all of us should try to learn from our experience, and particularly those of us who've been responsible as uniformed officers or civilians in any war for committing our people to the risk of death. We should be responsible for evaluating that and drawing lessons from it that can be applied to the future. And that's what I have felt, and that's why the book is written.
Have you walked along the wall?
Of
Vietnam
course.
Wall?
Oh, of course. It's a very, very moving experience.
Do you feel responsible for those names being up there?
Well, I was certainly part of the group that was, and I want to suggest to you, as I said, that we were trying to prevent the loss of 20 times as many. We were trying to prevent a world war. We were trying to prevent endangering the security of this nation. And by the way, we had, in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we prevented a nuclear war. But you're damn right, I feel responsible. And my debt is to expose the mistakes, examine the lessons, and try to suggest how they can be applied to the future.
Your wife passed away some years ago.
15.
When young people get married, you're always a hero in the other one's eyes. When she passed away, were you still a hero in her eyes?
Well, that's a good question. I hope so. We certainly were still in love. We met when we were 17. I had 2 deferments in World War II. One because I was teaching in an officer candidate school, and a second because I had a 1-year-old child. But I thought I should volunteer to serve overseas, which I did. And she thought so, and she supported it.
That's pretty tough when you have a 1-year-old
You're
child.
damn right. And I had no money. I'm not exaggerating. I had 0 money. My first step was to go as a War Department consultant to England. I had to borrow $100 from the dean at Harvard, where I was teaching, to buy a 3-day $10,000 life insurance policy to fly on the Yankee Clipper to Britain. And the policy was well worth it. The Clipper crashed on the next trip and killed several people. But the point I'm making, I had 0 money, and she was willing to do that.
Why did your wife feel you should go into the war?
Because she felt as I did, that's the responsibility of a citizen, to serve his nation.
Did she know your feelings before she passed on, that maybe you had blown it in Vietnam?
Oh, yes, of course.
What did she say to you?
Well, one of the problems was, one of the reasons that she developed ulcers and ultimately had 2 operations at Hopkins because of them was I didn't talk much about it. And that was, it was very difficult for me to talk to my wife and my children about it. My children were, in a sense, college age at the time, and their friends were protesters. If I could tell you one story.
Would you have sent your own kids in?
Yes, absolutely. One of my children, you don't have time to hear it, but he was of draft age and so on. It's an interesting story, but we don't have time, I guess. But I just want to tell about the middle child, daughter, lived in Washington, and she had a friend who literally mobilized the protesters and led them in marches against the president and against me. And then she would invite this friend home for dinner. And in one of these occasions, he was having dinner in my home where I still live in Washington. And after dinner, we went into the library and we talked till about 10:30. And as he got up to leave, he said, in all seriousness, he said, well, nobody can be all bad who loves the mountains as much as you do. Now that man's name was Sam Brown. A year ago, he was nominated to be ambassador to the Council on Security and Cooperation in Europe. He was opposed by Senator Helms, and Sam, on the grounds that he was a traitor during Vietnam. And Sam Brown wrote me a note and said, would I write a letter in support of his nomination? Which I did, because he wasn't a traitor. He was a protester. He was willing to serve if ordered to do it. But he was damn well going to try to stop it until he was ordered to do it.
There's a major difference between that and what Bill Clinton did during the war.
Well, I don't.
I know you don't want to get in with a sitting president, but he says he feels vindicated. Vindicated, the dictionary says what he did was justified. Do you believe it?
What he said was, I read the press conference, whatever it was, night before last or whatever. What he said was he thought that we should draw lessons from it, and we should engage in a healing process and try to learn for the future. And I agree with that.
Okay,
that's all I want to say.
We're going to take a break here. We will be back with the former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and his book, In Retrospect, right after these messages. Mr. Secretary, if somehow magically Jack Kennedy could walk into this room right now and say, how you doing? And you say, how you doing? And he says, did we blow it? What would you say to Jack Kennedy?
I said we started to blow it, Mr. President, under your presidency. You weren't responsible for what happened afterwards. We could have, although we'd started to blow it, we could have changed. We didn't. So I can't blame you as much as I blame ourselves.
What would you say to President Johnson if he showed up?
Well, I'd say, Mr. President, we blew it. And it wasn't solely your responsibility. It was that of all of us. And I think you would wish us today to try to, in retrospect, which is the title of the book, in retrospect, examine how it was we made the mistakes, which I think we made. Now, I know, Mr. President, that some of your associates, Dean Rusk, who died December 20 last year, to the day he died, didn't believe we blew it. But, Mr. President, I believe we blew it. And I think we should learn from that so it won't happen again. That's what I think you, Mr. President, would want us to do. Johnson was a pretty tough guy. And he was tough enough to say, by God, I was wrong, and let's learn from it, and let's not do it again. I think that's the way he'd respond to my point.
If somehow magically you could bring back 58,000 dead men and you were on a platform in a huge field and they were there and you had a PA system and you could address those men, what would you say to them?
I'd say just what I said to President Johnson. I'd say, we've got to learn. We owe you that. And let me, if I may, draw your attention, you've probably read it, but perhaps your audience hasn't, to an article that appeared in this week's Newsweek. It was written by Colonel Hackworth. He is
one of the most decorated men in Vietnam.
Not one of the most decorated. He was wounded 4 times in Vietnam. He fought in Korea. He was wounded 4 times in Vietnam. He has 101 decorations, the most decorated man in the Army. He's now out of the Army. And he wrote an article that's in this week's Newsweek, and I want to read just the last sentence or so. He said, McNamara's book is an important step toward understanding what happened. That's the first point. Let's understand what happened. And it may help, in addition, understand what happened in order to avoid it in the future. And he said, it may help some of the walking wounded to move farther along the path of healing. And he said, that's good for America's soul.
Would you say, as a final comment to those men in the field, I'm sorry?
Of course I'm sorry. But saying, you know, that's not enough. My God, I'm sorry for lots of things in my life. That's not a, learn the lesson so you don't have to do it again. So you never have to say, I'm sorry again, at least for that same error. That's what we owe those men. And that's what Hackworth is talking about.
Doing what you're doing is courageous in its own way, to come out and take this hit. You don't need to take this at your age and in your station in life. Why'd you decide to do it?
Because I think that's what we owe society. And more broadly, let me just say, I think every citizen has a debt to his fellow citizens. And part of that debt can only be met by responding to his government's request to serve, whether it be state, local, or federal, when he's asked. And I don't think enough of our people are willing to do that today. And then, having done that, if they commit errors, and many of us do in many cases, then they have an obligation to society to reflect on what they did and try to ensure that their successors don't make the same errors. And we should engage in that more often. I think our society is in terrible shape today, socially, financially, in a sense morally. And I think more of our leaders should be reflecting on how we got there and how we can get out of it. And I don't think we have yet done that.
Haven't we, in a sense, walked away from either desiring or wanting moral leadership that we've...
I think so. And let me just use one illustration at this point. I think it is tragic. And I think every citizen in this country should, A, be aware of this fact, and B, feel partially responsible for it, and C, try to do something about it. It's tragic that in the capital of the richest country in the world, the infant mortality rate is twice that of Castro's Cuba. I just think it's terrible. And I don't want to, this is not
No, that's fine.
But you ask why I wrote the book.
Right.
I wrote the book because I think all of us who serve, you serve in a senior position in our society. I hope sometime you'll write a book on your experience as a corporate executive.
I tell you, there are a hell of a lot of people frightened that I might.
Well, to tell you the truth, I signed a contract to write an autobiography, and in my proposal to the publishers, and there were 4 of them who bid on it, I said what I was going to write, and what I said I was going to do was reflect on I'll call it the errors of the auto industry, and the errors of other parts of my life, and in the World Bank, I think we accomplished a tremendous amount, but we also had some failures, and I wanted to reflect on that. This is not mea culpa. This is saying, for God's sakes, T.S. Eliot was right. We explore, we learn. Let's expose our learning so those who follow can take advantage of it. That's the point.
Will we have to fight for our freedom again?
Well, certainly I hope not in this way, but look what happened in Oklahoma. Look what happened at the Trade Center. Look what's happened twice in Japan in the last month or so. The world of the 21st century is going to be a world economy. And let me just say this. My earliest memory is of a day of a city exploding with joy. The date was November 11, 1918. It was Armistice Day. I was 2 years old. The city was San Francisco. It was celebrating the end of World War I, but it also believed, as Woodrow Wilson did, we'd fought a war to end all wars. We had, in this century, it's the bloodiest century in human history. We humans killed 160 million people by war. Is that what we want for the 21st century? Now, today there's no major war on the horizon, but for God's sakes, let's reflect on this. There are lots of other wars. We face all kinds of conflict. Let's reflect how we're going to save this nation and think about it in advance. This book points to that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We'll be right back. A few final thoughts right after this. Maybe only the Civil War caused the kind of heartbreak and self-examination that the war in Vietnam caused.
It's obvious we still have it.
Yeah, I think it's still there. Do you ever wish you could just make it go away, that it wasn't part of your life? Did you go through any personal depression over this, or?
Well, not depression in the sense you're talking about it, but it was a terrible trauma. Of course I wish it could go away. It can't go away.
What did your wife say to you before she passed away?
Well,
did she say that you did the best you could?
Oh, yeah. As I told you, we were deeply in love, and we admired and respected each other and wanted to help each other, and lived very, very close. Our family was and is very, very close. So she had gone through this terrible trauma of, in effect,
you being clammed up about it.
Yes, that's right. But before she died, she and I both agreed that, and this sounds Pollyannish to say, but we both agreed that our family had benefited from government service, and that all the children had faced tremendous stress, and she had faced tremendous stress, and I had faced tremendous stress, that we had learned about our nation, about the world, and about ourselves. And at the same time, we had done what she believed should be done, and I believe should be done, which is every citizen should serve when he's asked to.
Is the loyalty, once you go into government service, to your president, to your country? How difficult is that decision?
Well, it's of course to both, but under the Constitution, the loyalty of the cabinet officers is to the president. There's a major difference between, and I didn't really understand this when I went in government, but I learned there's a major difference between the parliamentary system of Britain and Germany, as an illustration, and our system. And the reason I say that is I learned because at one point we canceled a system called the Sky Bolt that the British were planning to buy, and Macmillan was the prime minister, and he came to a meeting in Nassau with Kennedy and me, and he said, my government's going to be overthrown because of what you did. And the point was that his defense minister had been elected by his own people, hadn't been appointed by Macmillan, and Macmillan's cabinet could overthrow him. In our case, I had not been elected, the president had been elected. He was the only point, except the vice president, the only person in the executive branch elected. My job was to serve him. Now, on a matter of principle, if I didn't agree with him, I should resign. Up to the end, and I don't want to say I didn't think about resigning, but up to the end, I felt A, he wanted me to stay, and B, I was still being effective and trying to pursue what I thought was the proper policy, and therefore there was not a basis on principle for me to resign.
What did you learn about yourself through this? When you first go to the White House in any capacity, there's a certain amount of ego involved. I've known many men, you have too. Of course, you'd been a very successful executive prior to that at a very young age. Does it expand you and make you grow? Or
oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. I'll give you two illustrations. I learned after President Kennedy died, that was assassinated, that he had planned to make me Secretary of State. I was Secretary of Defense. And I have since told people, I told Bobby Kennedy, who told me this after President Kennedy died, I wouldn't have accepted. And the reason was I knew myself. I knew I was not wise enough, experienced enough to be secretary. I wouldn't have accepted. Johnson asked me to accept the vice presidential nomination in '64. Now, if I'd accepted it, I knew him well enough. He might have said to Margaret next week, Margaret, I can't burden you with that. But the point is, I said no to Johnson because I knew I wasn't wise enough at that time to be vice president.
The book, in retrospect, Secretary Robert S. McNamara. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.